Hello and welcome back. Today they let me out of my box and allowed me to talk in the gallery, and what I'm going to talk about is our Phil Rogers show, a wonderful Leonard Rosoman painting, and this gorgeous Derek Greaves behind me. I hope you enjoy it. We buy as many Derek Greaves as we can get hold of, and we've been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years. Greaves came to prominence very early in his life. He was still at the Royal College in the early 50s when, along with three others, John Bratby, Jack Smith and Edward Middleditch, he became part of what was known as the Kitchen Sink School of Art, showed with those other three in the Venice Biennale in 1956. So thereafter they went their separate ways. And Greaves, who is now in his early 90s, is still painting. This particular example is really very special. Greaves's control of paint is quite extraordinary. But in this painting, he's given up part of that control, and here, maybe difficult to see on camera, but let's hope you can pick it up, has allowed the paint just to drip. And I've never ever seen him do that before. We had a Greaves in here a little while back, and one of the country's leading art historians was chatting with me and looking at it, and remarked that if this had been an American painting, it would have been probably of a similar period. It would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars. So these, I think, are remarkable value. And this, a particularly interesting example of great British art still at affordable prices, not yet gone to the hundreds of thousands that no doubt it will make one day. We show the work of Phil Rogers every 3 years. The first major show of pots shown in this gallery some 20 years ago was that of Rogers, and we've been working closely with him ever since. Phil is invariably helpful, a great sounding board, and invariably there to advise. It was Phil Rogers who introduced us first to Ken Matsuzaki and to Kang-hyo. Our deal with Phil, as it is with other potters who we work with, is that he only gives us his best pots. The best pots are set aside from every firing over a 3-year period, waiting for the Goldmark show. Lisa Hammond stores hers under the floorboards. Potting's a strange business. Most people who make things, who manufacture, are manufacturing to order, but not so the potters. They're making speculatively, and their making process, the manufacturing process, is beset with danger. I remember one occasion when Sven Bayer smashed the entire contents of 2 kiln loads that he had made. For our part, we repay the potters by using our best endeavours to find as many new homes for the pots as we possibly can. Our last Phil Rogers show, 3 years ago, I think we sold 420 something pots. It was something like that. And we do that by treating the whole thing really seriously. First, we need a lot of pots from the potters. Secondly, we make a fully illustrated catalogue with every show. And the other thing we do is make films about the potters. And all of this has led to a situation where we now sell regularly all over the world. This particular Phil Rogers show, which is quite astonishing in terms of its quality, has already been remarkably successful. We've sold 2 sets of Gwionomis, one remaining, and you have only to look over there at the scoreboard to get some indication of the number of pots that have already sold. I think it's something just over 400 already, and even during this time of lockdown, this difficult time when people have not been able to come in here, we've sold this tremendous amount mail order, and they've gone to the States, Taiwan, Germany, France, Belgium. I think we've sold to Australia, all over the place. What we ask of every potter before every show is that what they give us is the very, very best that they can manage at that moment in time. For me, pots are very, very personal. It's difficult to explain how that happened or why I've been buying and using and giving away and breaking pots for nearly 50 years now. Can't even remember what started that. But I know how much they have become part of my life. There's one story that I'd like to tell because it does have something to do with Phil Rogers. Nearly 20 years ago, the result of smoking 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes a day and living on coffee and little sleep, I found myself in hospital having had a heart attack. I was lying in intensive care the following morning, feeling extremely sorry for myself, when my wife Fiona came in, and there I was with drips coming out of me and all sorts. And the first thing she did when she came in was to put her hand in her handbag, and she pulled out a Phil Rogers Gwionomi. It was that one. It was one of the first things that she ever gave me when we met, long before I actually met Phil. And it was my favourite pot at that time. I used to use it a lot. And she took the Gwionomi out of her bag. She reached across to the little plastic cup full of water that the NHS had provided, and she poured the water into the Gwionomi. She threw the little plastic cup away, and she put the Gwionomi into my hands. And it was that act that reminded me what life was really about. It gave me a fresh reason. It stopped me feeling quite so sorry for myself and made an enormous effect. I'm not suggesting that that's a good idea for people to go have heart attacks to find out how important pots are, but it's a little story to illustrate just what a great pot can do for you. The quality of the pots in this show that Phil's given us is quite remarkable. I just want to show you one here. This happened to be standing near this one. Just a beautiful, beautiful pot. And when I look round at the pots that we still have remaining, something like 100 left, thereabouts, most of them online, and we're putting more online as quickly as we can go. I could almost reach out and touch anything and think I could add that to my own collection without a problem. They're just absolutely outstanding work. I should perhaps add something else, and that this has happened during lockdown. Although we laid the gallery out in the way that we normally would for a ceramic show, a pot show, all these pots, these hundreds of pots that have gone, have been bought by people online who have trusted what they see. The remarkable sales that we've had this time, which are going to be even bigger than the last show that we had at Phil's 3 years ago, have happened without a single person being able to come here and handle the pots. Extraordinary. Right from the very early days of our relationship, I always felt that he was a great Gwionomi and Gwionomi maker. I had lots at home, which I used. And for a show, I think it was in the beginning of the early 2000s, we discussed the idea that he should make for the show 80 Gwionomis and 80 Gwionomis. And to that end, we made a shelf so that when they arrived, when the Gwionomis arrived, we could put them on the shelf and that would be easy to display in the exhibition. When it came in and we dressed the shelf, it just looked fantastic. And I suggested to Jay, I think at the time, that he'd take a photograph of it and that we just send it out in the ether and see what happens. This was way before the show. I think it had been gone out about 3 minutes when we got a call from one of our customers in Germany who prior to that had only bought paintings from us, asking to buy it, and we sold it as a oneer. Subsequently, we have sold, I think, 15 or 16 more, and here is the latest set. I want to say right from the start that what you're looking at here is not an installation. This is a shelving unit that has on it 80 Gwionomis that you can use. I would love Phil to be able to make masses and masses of these for us, but he can't. And the reason for that is because they come from 3 separate kilns that he fires only occasionally during the year, and in the kilns they can only sit in certain areas. So the maximum that he can make for us now is about 2 sets a year. Actually, for this exhibition, which has been 3 years in the planning, there are just 3 sets, 2 of which have already sold. It is extraordinary, I think, that you look at this giant of a Welshman, 6'7" or something, who is adept at making these enormous pots that we're all used to, and that he can still produce pots of such delicacy as you find here. Every single one of them different, and every one a gem. They're not organised in a specific way. You do what you like with them, but the main thing that Phil wants you to do, we want you to do, is to actually use them. And traditionally, of course, in Japan, Gwionomi was a sake cup, but actually, I think it was the great Takashi Yasuda said he makes the pots. The potters are to make the pots. It's for us to do what we like with them. And at home we use ours for seeds and nuts and dips and all sorts of things like this. Anyway, there were 3 sets for this exhibition. 2 have gone. This is the final one. Absolutely beautiful. I simply love the work of Leonard Rosoman. I didn't actually make his acquaintance originally through paintings, it was through books and his book illustration. These 2 in particular, this wonderful book, Make Me an Offer, which is one of my favourite books, and A Kid for 2 Farthings, both illustrated for Wolf Mankiewicz. It was years later that I realised he was a painter as well, but he was a teacher, he taught Hockney, and I think he suffered somewhat because he did all sorts of things. He would do an advert, he would do murals, he would do whatever was necessary to keep him painting and to keep the money coming in. People who do that are not necessarily favoured by the British art establishment, who prefer that an artist does one thing. I think he suffered maybe a little bit like Michael Ayrton, who did lots and lots of things. Rosoman is now really coming into his own, which I think, because of this wonderful book by Tanya Harrod on Rosoman, shows him as a great painter that he is. This particular painting is iconic in the oeuvre of Rosoman. In 1954, Rosoman had his first show with the great gallery Roland Browse and Del Banco, and Lillian Browse, really known as the I think she was called the Duchess of Cork Street. She had amazing eyes, and in the middle of the 20th century, she was really the lady. If she chose you, you had real quality. She was absolutely tremendous. In 54, Rosoman had his first show there. 50 years later, when Rosoman was 90, Lillian Browse asked him whether he would do a portrait of her. And this is what he produced. It was a double portrait of Lillian Browse together with her Rodin sculpture, and illustrated in Tanya Harrod's book. And in the same year that it was painted, it was in the Royal Academy summer show. Lillian Browse then gave it to a dear friend of hers, and it's been in that collection ever since, until we got it just a few weeks ago. So what you have here is a wonderful picture by Rosoman of one of the great ladies of British art, Lillian Browse, Duchess of Cork Street.
I came back here to Rhayader because my grandparents had passed away, so there was a cottage sitting empty. And I was penniless, really, had nothing. I'd spent everything I had on a kiln and a wheel. That was the lot. And so we had this little cottage to live in for, I think we stayed in there for about 18 months while we got going. And I've now been here for 35 years. And it's a beautiful place to live. I've got the most amazing view from my yard across the mountains towards Aberystwyth. The River Wye is 2 fields away. So I always tell people I live on the banks of the Wye, but it's a very long and slow bank. And I happen to live only 2 miles from the Elan Valley, where there's the range of lakes that go up. Most beautiful scenery, and once you get up onto the top of those hills, it's like primeval. You know, there's nobody there, and in winter there's certainly nobody there except the sheep. Rhayader and this area, literally around between here and Tregaron, was the one place in Great Britain that the red kite clung on. We got down to about 10 pairs, I think, just at the time when I came to live here. So in those days, if you ever saw a red kite, it was a real event. You know, now I go outside and it's an event if I don't see one. I mean, they're absolutely amazing, the way that they've managed to increase their numbers. And I can remember clearly back in the late 70s when the Gurkhas were placed in trees around mid Wales to guard the eggs in case poachers came. So there were trees with Gurkhas in them, ready to pounce on poachers looking for the eggs, to steal the eggs. But now, I mean, the record out in my field, over my field, 80 red kites. That's my record. They're difficult to count because they keep moving, but it was around about 80, yeah. people sometimes tend to think that a potter sits in a sort of rural idyll and just sits at the wheel all the time making pots, and that's not how it works. I mean, I think I spend probably less than a quarter of my time actually making pots. Come on, this way, come on. My day starts quite early. I'm usually up by 7, and my first job is to check emails and to write back any correspondence. And if I get that done, then I don't have to worry about it all day. So I do that. That's my first thing. Then I take the dogs out. That's next thing. They know when it's time to. As soon as I put the lid on the top of the marmalade, they know that's their signal. So they're ready to go. Fetch it to me. Fetch it to me. Thank you. And I'm usually in the workshop by sort of 9:30. If it's a throwing day, I'll throw all day and maybe I'll finish around 6. Sometimes it's a clay mixing day, sometimes it can be glazing, mixing glazes, sometimes it's kiln packing. It's an awful lot of hard work being a potter, really. To make pots full-time for a living, it is hard work. And a lot of it is drudgery. You know, a lot of it is cleaning kiln shelves, mixing clay. All of these things are laborious and not particularly creative. I'm quite happy working in it's not so much a tradition, I think it's more of a genre. And my influences are many. I mean, sometimes people look at my work and they kind of mistakenly see just a very small influence, but in fact the influences are many. I've been influenced by Korean pottery always, since starting. I ended up married to a Korean lady, but I was interested in Korean pottery right from the very beginning. Certain Japanese pottery, not all Japanese pottery by any means, but certain Japanese pottery. Late medieval German salt glaze, 17th and 18th century English slipware, American settler pots, pots that were made all up the east coast of America from North Carolina right up into New York. Mostly pots made by German and Dutch immigrant. So there was a huge connection between what they were making because they'd made it first of all in Europe. All of those influences fed their way into what I was trying to do. And then much later on I became influenced by Bernard's pots, the pots themselves, and by Hamada particularly. And here, this one, that's a Bernard Leach. And I really like this pot because apart from the fact that the decoration is so immediate and so simple in many ways, but quite sophisticated in others, I also like the fact that it's an ash glaze, and I've always worked with ash right from the very beginning. I worked with wood ash, so that's an ash glaze that Bernard made using wood ash and local clay, the red clay from St. Earth, which is near St. Ives. And this one is Hamada. And I make quite a lot of press molded pots. Some years ago, I had a period when I had a really bad back, and I wanted to get off the wheel for a bit. I wanted to move, the bending over. So I made some molds and started making press molded bottles. So that's why I've sort of picked this one out, really, because it's press molded. But such vibrant brushwork, brushwork done not prissy. It's not done with your tongue between your teeth, It's just bam, bam, bam. But it's the confidence and that little element of genius that Hamada had that creates something like that. And this one bowl is not an easy thing to make. It's an easy thing to throw a bowl. It's almost the first thing that anybody makes when they get on the wheel is a bowl. But to get the tension right between the rim and the form, it's almost something that you can't describe. That tension that exists in a rim, in its relationship to the volume of the pot. Hamada was a genius. There's no question about that. I mean, he just made it look easy. The fun part for me is the throwing. What keeps me interested in making pots is working on the forms and making the forms work. So if I get an idea for something, the challenge to make that work, that's what keeps me interested. And I very much enjoy that aspect of it. I don't design on paper very much. I do draw and I do sketch shapes and ideas, but generally throwing for me is like drawing in the air. You're creating a line in the air and that line is alterable. You can change it. That's the nice thing about clay, because it's soft and you can change it immediately. I could never become a metal worker or a woodworker because you have to really put some effort into changing anything and it's not immediate. I can poke my thumb into the side of a pot, that's changed it. Split second, you know. So that's the nice thing about clay, that it's immediate. The drawback in pottery is that there is so much that can go wrong. Every stage there's something that can go wrong. And we as potters, when you're working to make a living from pottery in the way that I do, and people like in this country like Mike Dodd and Richard Batterham and Jim Malone and people who work in the kind of genre that I work in, we have to know an awful lot. You know, we don't just make the pots. We have to know how to make glazes. We have to have an understanding of basic geology. We have to know about fire and draft and pyromania and all of these things that go towards making up a potter. And it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of knowledge that you have to kind of to gather together. I try to use local materials if I can. I find that I'm somewhat limited here because most of the rocks that surround me, and it's rock that we use to make glaze, that's the basis of glaze. Most of those rocks are iron bearing, and so it's kind of limiting. There's very, very little clay around here because we're all on the rock. So, but I do try to use as much, and all of my glazes, well, not all, but pretty nearly all of my glazes contain wood ash. And so the wood ash comes from the fire in the house. I use a clay which I dig from the woods on the other side of town, and I use that as a slip. It's not a clay that you can throw with. It's a terracotta, not very plastic clay, so you can't throw with it, but I use it as a slip. So this is one of the few local materials that I can use. It's a very, very coarse earthenware clay. It fires to a terracotta flower pot colour, even though it doesn't look like that now, but it's got quite a lot of iron in it. And I use it as a slip, particularly for when I do the finger wiping to get that nice sort of red colour. It just acts as a thin surface on the clay to highlight that redness. I have tried throwing with it, but it's very, very coarse, and it's almost like throwing with sand, very fine sand. It's not very plastic, although that did roll into a sausage, which kind of proves that at least it's clay. I'm not a big decorator. I mean, I'm not a decorator in the sense that, you know, I use lots of brushwork or many different pigments and different sort of techniques, complicated techniques of wax resist and layer on layer. And I'm not very good at that, and I don't do it. On the other hand, I find it very difficult to let a pot go through without some form of decoration. So most of my decorations are in the clay, either in the clay or through a coating of slip. So I might draw through a white slip to reveal the body underneath. I might coat a pot in the local clay slip, which is a sort of reddish colour, and then glaze it and then wipe that glaze away to reveal the slip underneath, something that I call finger wiping. Sometimes I'll use stamps and impress the pot with stamps, or use a wooden tool with a comb on it to draw. And most of the decorations are there to give the ash glazes, which are quite fluid, something to work on, something to pool in and to change colour, to change texture. And any decoration that I do in the clay, particularly if it's through a white slip, those glazes will highlight it. So you get this effect where you have a glaze that's pooled in a drawing, changed colour, become darker, become shinier, and that highlights that little drawing in front of a sort of lighter, mistier background. Firings don't always come out perfectly well. I've got 2 kilns at the moment. I've got 3 kilns, but 2 kilns that I'm using at the moment. And the one is normally very reliable, and the other one, the wood kiln, is largely reliable, but not always. Right, dog, let's go see what we've got in the kiln. Come on. When you put an exhibition together, like the one that I'm putting together now for the Goldmark gallery, that takes a little while. And the pots for that exhibition, I've been collecting, putting the best aside for almost 18 months. First thing that you feel when you open a kiln, or I feel anyway, is a sense of relief that everything's in one piece and nothing terrible has happened. I can see that it's just got a little bit hotter in the front than usual, which is a surprise because it's a very tight pack, so I didn't think it would get to the front quite as much, but it has. You can see that cone is well down. So maybe just a fraction too hot in the front, but that's about right. And you can see that side and that side are quite different, and this is the slightly hotter side. But I still think it's come out well. So far it looks okay, but I'm always more concerned about the back, because the back gets a little bit hotter. So if the front has got hot, then I'm slightly worried that the back might have overfired a little bit, but I put glazes at the back that quite like a little bit of extra heat, so hopefully it'll be okay.
I'm looking for the best Gwionomi.
Yes. It's okay. What do you think, Ethan? What do you think? What do you think? Good one? Is it a good one or not? Yeah? Okay. Yes, good one. No stealing the limelight. I think that pottery's at a bit of a crossroads, actually. I think that in recent years, the colleges in this country, some of them have closed, a lot of them have closed their courses. Those that are left are concentrating more on a sort of conceptual path away from making pots and away from using the wheel, which I find worrying and a bit sad, really. I think that, you know, the way that the colleges have sidelined the wheel is reflected in some of the ceramic magazines, for instance, which now no longer feature pots anymore. And I think that's sad. I think that we have a situation where it's easy to think, well, who's going to be teaching what I do in 20 or 30 years' time when I'm gone and when other potters in my sort of genre have gone? We're all dead and buried. Who's going to be working then? Who's going to be teaching? And on the one hand, I think these things are cyclical. I think that, you know, fashions change, and I think probably there will be a movement back towards that sort of more earthy and basic way of making pots that people tend to understand. Not so much these sort of conceptual art ceramics that people do often find difficult. And I also think that this move of the last 10 to 15 years, where particularly urban potters living in central London, central Manchester, Birmingham, and they all seem to be making this rather bland porcelain, glazed white or with a very pale celadon, tablewares. And I kind of think, well, on the one hand, people are perfectly at liberty to make whatever they want to make, and I would never stop anybody doing that. But these things are I often look at them, I think, well, actually, that would be better made in a factory. They show no sign of adventure, no sign of clay as a once plastic soft material that, you know, they've robbed all that away from it. And we have this kind of banal, dead and banal sort of porcelain, which to me would be better made in a factory.
These days, nobody needs to buy a big jug. For a start, it's quite rare, I think, that people would serve a lot of drink from a big jug, you know, ale or anything like that. You just don't these days. You buy them in bottles or whatever. People don't need them. So why are they buying them? They're buying them partly because they want to feel a connection between the pot and the maker and themselves, and partly because they see it in the same way that someone else might see a sculpture. It's an object. It's got line, it's got shape, it's got form, it's got orchestration, all of those things, and people just like to have them around and look at and to appreciate and feel the sort of historic connection in the object. One thing you don't need with a jug is for it to be heavy for its size, because by the time it's filled with liquid, nobody's going to be able to pick it up. So with a jug like this compared to, let's say, a bottle, I would always try and do sort of one extra pull at the end to get it as light as I can. tend to use a bank card for as my rib. Yeah. For this kind of work, I find them the best. It's often the case with pots, particularly bigger pots. I find that the refining of the shape takes longer than the pulling up of the mass, so that you get the height, and then getting the shape right and refining the shape and getting it exactly as you want it takes longer than the actual throwing. Of course, with pots this size, jugs this size, I mean, the wall of the pot now is really quite thin because I don't want that extra weight because it's a jug. So of course that makes it even trickier to get the shape just right. It's quite delicate. And I'm always bearing in mind my glazes and the glaze that's going to be on the pot. So I'm thinking now, okay, let's say this is going to have one of the ash glazes. The ash glazes rely on ridges and engraving or marks of some description for them to pool on and to flow into. So I'm just putting a little bit of a concave profile into that rim here so that the ash glaze will sit on that ledge there and create a slightly different texture and a different colour. It's like the black hole of Calcutta and I can't see a thing. Then I'll turn it away from me and just gently hold it and bring it back up like that. It's very important not to disturb that line that you create going around, because that's very difficult to repair. So just try not to touch that. That's it.
After 35 years of making pots and probably having made maybe 150,000 pots in that time, the hands are not quite what they were. My thumb joints here are, in the specialist surgeon's words, worn out, and I have to have injections in here every 4 or 5 months to keep them going. So that might have a bearing on what I do in the future. It might be that I might not be able to make so many big pots in the future. Maybe we'll be looking at smaller things, perhaps. I don't know. But certainly carry on making and developing and trying to get better. We always, all through the time I've made pots, I've always thought the next firing is going to be the best one. And you have to think like that. If you sit back and think, that's it, I've done my best, then you might as well give up. You've always got to be looking to do something better. When I do an exhibition, I always like to try and bring something new in, if I can. So I'm always thinking about something new to bring, and that's why I started making salt glaze. That's why I built the wood kiln. I wanted to keep pushing the boundaries a little bit. I also wanted to try everything before I got too old to do it, you know, hence the wood kiln. I mean, I think that's if not a young man's game, it's certainly not an old man's game, you know, firing. It's a lot of work, you know, 36 hours straight firing 2.5, 3.5 tons of wood. It's quite physical, but I love the effects that it gives you.
This hakame, or what the Koreans would call kuyal, is something I've been working on for a little while now, which is not surprising as my wife is Korean, so I get to see quite a bit of it from time to time. And these are the latest and I think most successful that we've managed. The clay has a lot of iron in it, so it's very dark. And what's taken me a long time to get right is the glaze to put over the top of it. I needed one for the cool corner of the kiln over there. This technique is, if it's fired too high, you lose the colour. Everything sort of comes out the same sort of grey, so you need to keep the temperature down. One nice thing that you get with these lower temperatures is that if there's something in the clay or the slip that gives you a little tiny pinhole, you get these lovely sort of little pink and orange spots. And in Korea and Japan, you often see pots which are covered in these beautiful pink circles, pink blushes, and they call them pink flowers. And these are certainly the best that I've had yet. And I've been working on it now for probably 3 or 4 years, but because I only fire this kiln twice a year, it doesn't give you much chance to test anything, you know. So any sort of development like that takes a long time. But yeah, I'm quite happy with these. The kiln has a cool corner. That corner over there is cooler than the rest of the kiln, and so it's a convenient spot to put these because they don't need too much temperature. You can see here that the difference that just an extra few degrees of heat makes, the difference between the colour here and the colour here. This is sort of paler. The glaze has stayed sort of slightly milkier because it hasn't had that extra few degrees of temperature. Here the glaze has become a little more translucent, transparent. That's the sort of fine line that you're walking with a kiln like this, that a pot can be successful or not successful, just literally from one pot being 12 inches away from another. Because the flame and the heat passes through the kiln in much the same way that water flows through a stream. It'll go round rocks and so on. Flame and smoke and vapour rather do the same thing in a wood kiln. So pots, even though they can be as little as a foot apart inside the kiln, can actually be maybe 10 degrees different in temperature, or maybe more sometimes. So, you know, that's why you get that effect where the same glaze doesn't work quite as well on this one as it has on this one. So for the future, gosh, I'm not sure. I think I just carry on making pots, and I've been working flat out for the last 6 months, 100 miles an hour, and now we have a new baby. He's coming up to 7 months now, and for the first time since the year that John Lennon was killed, that was 1981, I think, or 82. For the first time since then, I've actually booked a holiday. So we're going away for a week to Anglesey next month. So that'll be interesting, going on the beach with my new son, baby son, and think about where I want to go with it next.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jugs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.